By now, we have already looked at different routing management scenarios. The method that we used was to define route attributes. These attributes can be either defined for a specific destination in the vendor tariff, such as category, preference, or even hunt stop. There is also a set of attributes that we can configure directly on the routing plan. We've allowed our residential customers to send calls via default and low cost routes and excluded premium in our previous example. The algorithm of route processing is the following. First, the routes are sorted according to their category. The routes belonging to the same category are further sorted according to preference. Routes with the same preference are then sorted by the least cost. This algorithm has been widely used and it meets our needs in the majority of the cases. However, we also came up with an alternative. I prefer to illustrate this alternative on a practical example. According to our experience, usually the customer has a very specific request to the Porta billing administrator. The account manager may request, for example, for the calls from customer A to Zimbabwe mobiles to be urgently routed to carrier E, using carrier D only as a backup. The other carriers should be, according to this request, excluded as soon as possible. The administrator in this case checks the routing plan. In our routing plan business, we have two categories. We have default with priority 60 and premium with priority 50. So right now, our routing plan contains carrier A, then carrier B, and carrier D. Our carrier E is in the VIP route category. If the administrator changes the routing plan to VIP with priority 80 and premium with priority 50, this means carrier E moves to the top of our list, then we'll have carrier D, according to this new routing plan. If we check the routing simulation right now, we won't find any problem, or if the customer makes a call, we won't find any problem either. So where is our actual problem? The issue here is that we don't know exactly how these recent changes influence the routing of all other calls to other destinations. The issue is that these routing categories have not only been assigned to Zimbabwe mobiles, but also to a large number of other destinations that we have in our vendor tariff. As a consequence of this so-called uncontrolled change, it may turn out that there are no longer any available routes to Ukraine because all the routes had a default category and default is not included in our routing plan. Or that another carrier, let's call it a carrier F, has a very expensive premium rate to Brazil of $2 a minute. But according to our routing plan, this is exactly where our calls are going to be sent. We can conclude, therefore, that the administrator cannot foresee the global consequences of a simple change that fulfills a customer's request. So this is definitely something for our administrator to avoid. We came up with a solution that allows fine-tuning the routing to a particular destination group. We are speaking in terms of specific carriers and connections. Basically, we're indicating the routing direction. Route this customer's calls to here or to there. This alternative routing configuration method is called routing override. It's configured for a specific destination group. In our example, we could change the routing only for Zimbabwe mobiles, or on other occasions only for Australia, Spain, or Ukraine. Routing override requires an explicit connection list. So if the administrator's intention is to send the calls from this customer to a specific gateway in New York, this is where the calls are going to be sent. Additionally, we introduced a feature that allows to redistribute the calls among connections according to the percentage rate specified in the route override configurations. The same vendor may have several connections. Let's say our vendor G has a connection in Europe and another one in Asia. However, we prefer to send calls to Europe through this vendor because the quality is optimal. If we didn't send any calls to his Asian gateway, this vendor wouldn't be happy and may suggest removing this connection. To keep the vendor happy and our customers happy as well, we may configure our system to send 75% of the calls through connection A and 25% of the calls through connection B. If we have specified the explicit connection list for a specific destination group, but none of these vendors are available at the time the customer tries to establish a call, the system will try to establish the call through the remaining connections in the preference and LCR order. If routing override is configured, our algorithm is going to look like this. First, when a customer places a call, we check whether the dial destination matches any destination groups. Then we check the routing rule for that particular destination group, and if there are none, then the preference and LCR is applied to calculate the routing list. Let's see how it's done on our web interface now. Let's go to our routing plans and create a new one. Let's call it YouTube test with override. Let's enable the toggle LCR override, or least cost routing override. Our recommendation is not to use it together with define a specific order for the route categories. Let's disable this. And now let's choose our destination group set in the drop-down. It's going to be zip trunking customers. Okay, and let's click Save. And now let's configure our routing plan to send calls to Zimbabwe mobiles through our carriers E and D. Let's add a new rule. Our destination group is going to be Zimbabwe mobile. Let's click Add. And now let's define the list of routes we want the system to use for this destination group. Okay, let's add route. Our first route is going to be carrier E. Let's tick the box and click OK. And let's click Add Route one more time and add carrier D the same way. Our carrier E has one connection via Asian SBC node. This vendor and its connection is going to be at the top of the list, and the US gateway connection for carrier D is going to be used as a backup. So now we have only two routes for Zimbabwe mobile. Let's click Save. So we get a warning that we need to wait a little while before these changes take effect. This is because the information about connections and routing plans is cached by the billing engine, so it takes a bit of time before the new configuration is applied. And now we are ready to test our routing plan. Let's introduce the number that we want to dial, as usual, and choose our routing plan. This is the new one we've just created with override, YouTube test with override. Okay. If we don't choose a routing plan, the routing list will be calculated using LCR. The carriers will be sorted by preference and then by price, because without a routing plan, route categories are ignored. Okay, let's run our simulation now. Okay, we see that our result is exactly the way we wanted it to be. Our carrier E is at the top of the list and our carrier D is at the bottom of the list. We were able to introduce the changes necessary without altering the routing plan for other destinations.